In corporate America, the loudest person is usually the one holding a match. My boss torched my career to keep his daughter clean, hoping to hide a $14 million failure before federal inspectors arrived. He assumed I would just take the severance and fade away quietly, but when you throw someone under the bus, you better make sure they do not hold the brakes. He thought he erased me, but he only erased his own alibi. Hello and welcome back to the loyal audience of Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for being here, but unfortunately, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us with no budget to continue our operations. If you enjoy today's story and want to support us, please consider joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to exclusive, true stories that are even better, longer, and filled with detailed situations we cannot make public on YouTube, complete with emotional multi-voice narration. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the comments section of this video. Now, let us begin today's story about a woman named Quinn Cruz. I am Quinn Cruz, a 32-year-old supply chain manager at Meridian Biosystems. Meridian is one of those private biotech companies that constantly preaches about saving lives, while simultaneously treating its employees like disposable batteries. The walls of our headquarters are plastered with motivational posters about integrity and synergy, words that the executive board abandoned years ago. It was a completely unremarkable Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk, exactly halfway through a miserable, lukewarm turkey sandwich, reviewing a complex spreadsheet regarding international shipping logistics. That was when the summons arrived via a sterile instant message from Human Resources. I was instructed to report immediately to the main executive conference room. The glass walls of that room always felt less like a symbol of corporate transparency and more like a high-end terrarium where upper management could gather to watch their subordinates squirm under pressure. Today, I was clearly the designated insect. I walked through the heavy glass doors to find Marcus Thorne, our executive vice president, practically vibrating with uncontained rage. His face was flushed, taking on the dangerous, mottled shade of an overripe plum. Flanking him on either side were the grim reapers of our HR department, two executives sitting rigidly with their matching legal pads and tight, unsympathetic expressions. And then there was Chloe Thorne. Chloe was Marcus's daughter, a walking, talking advertisement for blatant nepotism. She had been aggressively wedged into the newly invented, highly paid role of operations supervisor exactly 3 months ago, despite having absolutely no background in biotechnology or logistics. She sat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, suddenly finding the cuticles of her perfectly manicured fingers to be the most fascinating thing in the world. Before I could even reach out to pull a leather chair away from the table, Marcus slammed his heavy open palm against the wood. The sharp sound echoed violently against the glass panes. He picked up a thick, aggressively highlighted temperature shipping report and hurled it across the polished surface. It slid rapidly and stopped just a few inches from my hands. "You have completely compromised a $14 million batch of medical enzymes," Marcus barked, his voice echoing with a manufactured, theatrical fury. "You failed to monitor the critical cooling alerts. Quinn, this level of negligence is absolutely catastrophic. We are talking about a massive financial loss and a potential federal disaster." I did not flinch. I did not scramble to pick up the report or beg for context. Instead, my eyes locked directly onto Chloe. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense, thick with the kind of heavy silence that only exists when everyone present knows a massive lie is being born. Chloe stubbornly refused to meet my gaze. She kept her head down, continuously twirling an absurdly expensive designer ring on her right hand. Every single person sitting in that high-end terrarium knew the actual truth. We all knew exactly what had happened. It was Chloe who had manually bypassed the temperature warning systems last Friday afternoon. She had deliberately overridden the automated cooling alarms just so the shipment would clear the loading dock an hour early, allowing her to catch a flight for her weekend getaway. It was an open secret, floating heavily in the sterile, air-conditioned breeze of the conference room. My first natural instinct, cultivated by years of fighting for survival in the corporate world, was to defend myself. I wanted to demand a laptop, pull up the unalterable server logs, point my finger directly at the spoiled daughter, and demand a thorough, unbiased investigation. But as I looked past the red-faced vice president and glanced at the neatly arranged documents sitting in front of the HR director, cold clarity washed over me. Resting right on top of their tidy pile was a thick, unmistakable manila envelope, the severance package. They did not call me in here to uncover the truth. They did not want to hear my defense or review the data. This was not a meeting to resolve a $14 million crisis. It was a carefully orchestrated firing squad. My mind raced, connecting the scattered dots with the exact cold precision they had originally hired me for. I realized instantly that my secure system login had probably been disabled the very second I stepped away from my desk. I was already a ghost in their network. The narrative of my sudden incompetence had been completely written, heavily edited, and officially approved by the board before my lunch hour had even begun. Marcus was not simply firing a loyal employee. He was frantically sanitizing a corporate crime scene to protect his own blood from federal prison. In a toxic corporate environment like Meridian, the executives expect you to break when they apply the pressure. They thrive on the tears, the frantic pleas for a second chance, or the explosive, unprofessional anger that they can later document to justify their ruthless decisions. I refused to give them even a fraction of that satisfaction. I felt my racing heartbeat begin to steady. A strange, profoundly serene calm settled over my entire body. I knew exactly what I had built into the architecture of that supply chain. I slowly reached out and picked up the printed report. I merely glanced at the fabricated data points for a second, before placing it gently back onto the table, smoothing out the corners. Then, I reached up to my collar and unclipped my employee identification badge. The plastic mechanism snapped softly, breaking the tense silence of the room. I set the badge down deliberately, squarely on top of Marcus's forged document. I looked directly into Marcus's furious eyes, holding his gaze until he blinked first. Then I shifted my attention to Chloe, offering them both a bright, unwavering, and utterly terrifying smile. "Good luck with next month's federal audit," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and perfectly polite. The color instantly drained from Marcus's face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The two HR directors shifted uncomfortably in their expensive ergonomic chairs, exchanging nervous glances. Chloe finally snapped her head up, her eyes wide with a sudden unmasked panic that she could no longer hide. I did not wait for any of them to formulate a response. I turned on my heel and walked calmly out of the glass room, leaving them choking on the sudden, deafening silence. I strolled through the open plan office, feeling the collective, confused stares of my former colleagues burning into my back. I did not stop to pack a cardboard box. I did not say a single goodbye. I just walked straight out the sliding front doors and stepped into the bright midday sun. The game had just changed forever, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one walking away with the winning hand. The drive back to my apartment was exceptionally quiet. I did not turn on the radio or roll down the windows. I just let the steady, rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt ground me. There was absolutely no panic in my chest, no racing thoughts about how I was going to pay my rent or survive this sudden, unceremonious unemployment. In truth, I had been anticipating this exact scenario from the very minute Marcus proudly paraded his underqualified daughter onto our logistics floor 90 days ago. When you introduce a chaotic, entitled variable into a highly structured, delicate environment, a catastrophic failure is not merely a possibility, it is an absolute certainty. It was only a matter of time before she broke something incredibly expensive, and it was equally inevitable that her father would try to hand me the bill. I unlocked the door to my quiet, dimly lit apartment, dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, and walked straight to the refrigerator. I pulled out a single can of pale ale. The sharp hiss of the aluminum tab popping open was the loudest sound in the entire room, and it was incredibly satisfying after the manufactured, suffocating drama of that morning. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the cold liquid wash away the lingering stale air of the executive suite, and flipped open my personal laptop. Let me explain something fundamental about the Information Technology Department at Meridian. They are essentially a collection of overpaid amateurs who truly believe that changing a wireless password and installing basic firewall software constitutes high-level network security. They operate entirely on the surface, managing the shiny interfaces and the easily accessible software logs. They had absolutely no idea what was actually buried deep beneath the digital floorboards of our infrastructure. When I took over the supply chain division 4 years ago, I realized almost immediately that the company was playing fast and loose with federal compliance regulations to cut operational costs. To protect my own professional license, I quietly engineered and implemented a deep-level fail-safe protocol. I integrated it directly into the physical hardware of our cooling servers. It was essentially a digital black box, functioning completely independent of the superficial software layer that the IT team monitored. When Chloe decided to play God last Friday, she used her administrator privileges to force a system override on the software alerts. She manually silenced the warning alarms so she could leave early for her weekend trip. Over the weekend, when the medical enzymes began to rapidly degrade from the rising temperatures, Marcus undoubtedly panicked. He would have instructed his clueless tech team to scrub the main server logs, wiping away Chloe's digital footprints and replacing them with a fabricated narrative of my supposed negligence. They thought they had brilliantly sanitized the crime scene. They genuinely believed that deleting a few lines of code on a screen would somehow alter the physical reality of what had transpired. But they did not know about the black box. My hardware protocol did not just record the dangerous temperature fluctuations, it captured the exact timestamp of the system override, the specific terminal that was used, and the physical biometric login credentials that authorized the shutdown. Every single keystroke Chloe made was permanently burned into an immutable hardware directory that Marcus's IT team did not even know existed, let alone know how to access or erase. And here's the most beautiful poetic detail of this entire orchestrated disaster. A detail I kept entirely to myself as I watched them hand me my termination papers, that shipment. The one they loudly claimed was worth $14 million, was never meant to reach a real medical facility or a real patient. It was a decoy batch. Our biggest client, the Federal Department of Health, regularly runs covert compliance operations on private contractors who handle sensitive biological materials. A trusted contact within the federal agency had quietly tipped me off 2 weeks prior that our facility had been selected for a blind stress test. The government intentionally supplied us with a batch of highly unstable, synthetic compounds outfitted with microscopic tracking sensors to monitor our internal handling procedures. Marcus and Chloe did not just ruin a standard commercial shipment, they actively destroyed federal property during a classified audit, and then they committed corporate fraud to cover it up. I set my cold beer down on the wooden desk and typed a string of complex characters into my terminal. I initiated a secure, encrypted virtual private network connection, completely bypassing the clumsy firewalls of Meridian's main server. I knew my standard employee credentials had been permanently revoked the moment I stepped out of the glass room, but I was not using the front door. I slipped through a dormant maintenance portal I had coded myself years ago. I had a very narrow window before their automated sweeps might detect an external ping. My fingers moved across the keyboard with cold, rhythmic precision. I navigated directly to the hidden directory housing the black box data with one final decisive keystroke. I executed a lockdown command. I encrypted the entire hardware log with a military-grade cipher, sealing the data away. Nobody at Meridian would be able to alter, delete, or even view that file now. It was a perfectly preserved digital tomb, waiting patiently for the federal investigators to crack it open. I closed the terminal and watched the connection sever. The trap was officially set, and the lock was thrown. I opened a new browser tab, navigated to my professional networking profile, and calmly updated my employment status to indicate that I was actively seeking new opportunities. Finally, I picked up my mobile phone. I held the power button until the glowing screen faded to black. No panicked calls from former coworkers, no threatening messages from corporate lawyers, nothing but absolute, uninterrupted silence. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, took another long sip of my beer, and smiled. For the first time in 4 grueling years, my calendar was completely clear. My vacation had officially begun. 2 weeks evaporated into a delightful haze of sleeping in and drinking coffee that did not taste like corporate despair. I kept my phone powered down for the first few days, reveling in the glorious absence of urgent emails and fabricated emergencies. But eventually, human curiosity won the battle. When I finally turned the device back on, my screen immediately flooded with a continuous stream of anonymous text messages from my former colleagues, all of whom were eagerly watching the empire crumble from the inside. Through their covert, frantic updates, I learned that the company had officially crowned its new monarch. Chloe Thorne was now proudly parading around the logistics floor under the glittering, newly minted title of Acting Supply Chain Director. She had essentially warmed up my vacant desk chair before the Human Resources Department had even finished filing my termination paperwork. According to the detailed dispatches from the loading dock supervisors, Chloe was aggressively transforming the department into her own personal business school project. She mandated daily, hour-long mandatory meetings where she forced the seasoned logistics veterans to endure endlessly colorful presentation slides. Her digital presentations were absolutely suffocated with empty, meaningless corporate buzzwords. She confidently lectured men and women who had been moving freight for 2 decades on the urgent need for dynamic optimization and aggressive risk transformation, pausing only to wait for rounds of applause that never came. She even catered expensive sushi lunches to discuss synergistic supply pathways, completely ignoring the glaring reality that her team was drowning in operational backlog. Yet, the brutal, dark irony of it all was that this newly appointed director of a biomedical supply chain could not even read a standard cold storage barcode. When a frustrated warehouse manager handed her a scanner to verify a priority routing slip, she allegedly stared at the flashing red laser as if he had just handed her a dangerous alien artifact. It was a spectacular, almost theatrical display of weaponized incompetence, funded entirely by blind nepotism. Unsurprisingly, the internal infrastructure began to rot almost immediately. The daily operations of a massive biomedical facility cannot survive on motivational catchphrases and expensive designer suits. I had managed the entire floor using a highly customized, predictive allocation algorithm that I wrote from scratch during my second year at the company. It was a delicate, intricate engine that meticulously balanced carrier schedules, temperature constraints, and federal priority codes in real time. Without my daily calibration and oversight, the algorithm simply stopped routing. The resulting chaos was swift, absolute, and merciless. Small, routine shipments of basic medical reagents were suddenly ending up in the wrong loading bays, sitting unattended for hours. Pallets of highly temperature-sensitive compounds were missing their domestic flights because the automated dispatch system was generating cascading errors that no one on the floor understood how to resolve. The logistics team was flying completely blind, frantically trying to manually route thousands of packages using outdated paper spreadsheets, while their new director was busy choosing the perfect transition animations for her next team meeting. As the severe financial losses from these daily, compounding blunders began to stack up, the executive board naturally grew restless and demanded answers. My former colleagues reported that Marcus was working extreme overtime to extinguish the growing internal fires. His strategy, of course, was exactly what I had anticipated from a man of his moral caliber. During a tense quarterly review, he stood before the anxious shareholders and masterfully shifted the blame. He solemnly swore that the current operational turbulence was simply the unfortunate, lingering residue of my previous poor management. He painted a tragic, heroic picture of his brilliant daughter bravely trying to untangle the massive web of negligence that Quinn Cruz had selfishly left behind. It was a beautiful, desperate lie, and it was the only thin thread keeping his sinking ship afloat. While Marcus was busy building a massive shrine to his own hypocrisy, My career was taking a wildly different and significantly more lucrative trajectory. Just 8 days into my involuntary vacation, I received an unexpected phone call from a senior executive headhunter. They were directly representing Apex Biologistics. Apex was not just a competitor, they were the absolute apex predator in our industry, boasting a dominant market share that made Meridian look like a chaotic, disorganized lemonade stand. They had somehow caught wind of my sudden availability and invited me to their towering glass headquarters for an immediate, high-level interview. Walking into the Apex executive boardroom was like stepping into a completely different dimension of reality. There were no sweaty vice presidents desperately trying to cover their tracks, and there were no entitled heirs playing dress-up in roles they did not understand. I sat across from a panel of sharp, ruthlessly pragmatic executives who did not care in the slightest about corporate synergy or dynamic risk transformation. They only cared about raw, undeniable data and proven results. They had independently reviewed my supply chain efficiency metrics from the past 4 years, and they were profoundly impressed by the massive reduction in transit waste that I had single-handedly orchestrated. When the chief operating officer leaned forward and asked me why I suddenly left Meridian, I simply smiled, a calm, measured smile, and told them that my former employer and I had developed fundamentally different philosophies regarding strict federal compliance and absolute accountability. They nodded in silent, professional understanding. They knew exactly what kind of circus Marcus was running over there. By the end of that exact same week, I signed a heavily finalized, incredibly generous employment contract. I was officially the new Senior Operations Director at Apex Biologistics. The powerful new position came with a dedicated team of actual, seasoned professionals, a sprawling corner office with an unobstructed view of the city skyline, and a starting salary that was exactly double what Marcus had been paying me to fix his messes. I settled into my luxurious new leather chair, sipping a perfectly brewed, expensive espresso, and opened a secure browser window on my massive dual monitors. I did not need to hack into Meridian's fragile servers to watch their impending doom. I just needed to look at the publicly available schedule posted on the government domain. The Federal Department of Health publishes their quarterly compliance audit calendar for all Tier 1 biological contractors to see. I scrolled down the pristine digital list until I found Meridian. The countdown clock was aggressively ticking down to 0. I leaned back, steepled my fingers together, and allowed myself a long, highly satisfying, dark chuckle. Marcus and Chloe genuinely thought they had successfully buried their million-dollar mistake deep in the dirt, completely unaware that they had just built a massive, fragile glass house directly on top of a ticking landmine. I was getting paid an absolute fortune simply to sit in the VIP section and wait for the spectacular fireworks to begin. The Federal Regulatory Agency does not operate on a schedule of convenience, and they certainly do not send polite invitations when they smell blood in the water. Exactly 2 weeks after my unceremonious departure, they dispatched an official, unannounced mandate. It was a formal declaration of an emergency, on-site inspection. The notification stated, in cold and uncompromising legal terms, that a specialized team of federal auditors would be arriving at the Meridian Biosystems headquarters in exactly 48 hours. Their singular, explicit objective was to conduct a comprehensive quality and compliance assessment of the highly compromised $14 million biological shipment. The moment that notification hit the executive inbox, the atmosphere inside the Meridian corporate office rapidly devolved into a literal slaughterhouse of white-collar panic. My loyal former colleagues on the logistics floor kept my private messaging application constantly buzzing with a highly detailed, minute-by-minute broadcast of the absolute carnage. The normally composed director of legal affairs was seen physically sprinting down the carpeted hallways, his expensive silk tie completely undone and confidential papers flying haphazardly from his unzipped leather portfolio. Marcus Thorne, the man who had confidently orchestrated my professional execution, was reportedly sweating so profusely that he had to change his custom-tailored dress shirt twice before the lunch hour even arrived. He was frantically pacing the length of his corner office, locking the door, and barking desperate, highly illegal orders at his utterly terrified information technology team. He was aggressively demanding that they generate completely fabricated temperature logs and falsified maintenance reports to cover the massive, gaping holes in their operational narrative before the federal agents walked through the front doors. And then there was Chloe. The newly minted acting director of the supply chain suddenly experienced a violent collision with reality. She finally realized that her decorative, high-paying title came with terrifying, inescapable federal responsibilities. She was no longer just attending catered lunches and criticizing employee uniforms. She was the official head of the department under investigation. This meant she would be legally required to stand completely alone in the main conference room, face a panel of veteran federal inspectors, and deliver a comprehensive, highly technical presentation defending their disastrous cooling procedures. Witnesses on the floor reported that she was actively hyperventilating in the executive women restroom. She was sobbing hysterically into rough paper towels because she did not even know the fundamental difference between ambient storage and cryogenic freezing, let alone how to accurately explain a catastrophic system failure to ruthless government agents. The crown she had stolen was suddenly crushing her skull. As I was sitting at my sprawling new mahogany desk at Apex Biologistics, enjoying a quiet afternoon reviewing pristine optimization reports, my personal mobile phone vibrated violently against the wood. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. I let it ring 3 distinct times before smoothly sliding my finger across the glass screen to answer. I did not say a single word. I simply held the device to my ear and listened to the heavy, ragged, panicked breathing on the other end of the line. "Quinn," the voice finally rasped. It was Marcus. His usual booming, authoritative corporate baritone was completely gone, completely stripped away and replaced by a desperate, hollow, shaking whisper. "Listen to me very carefully, please. We have a massive, unprecedented situation unfolding over here, and I am willing to be incredibly generous to fix it. I can offer you a highly lucrative, short-term consulting contract right this very second. I am talking about $50,000. Quinn, $50,000 transferred immediately into your primary bank account today. No questions asked. All you have to do is log in remotely. Fix whatever strange glitch is currently freezing our primary reporting system, and clean up the remaining back-end data before the end of the day. Just a few hours of remote work. Nobody ever has to know we spoke." I leaned back deeply into my plush executive chair and looked out the massive glass window at the sprawling sunlit city below. I could literally hear the sheer, unadulterated terror vibrating in his vocal cords. He was a drowning man desperately throwing handfuls of wet cash at the person standing safely on the shore. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out between us, ensuring he felt every single agonizing second of his impending ruin. "I do not have access to the fraud folders, Marcus," I replied, my voice dripping with cold, deliberate, surgical sarcasm. "Wish Chloe a fun presentation for me." I did not give him a fraction of a second to utter another pathetic syllable. I pressed the red button and ended the call, instantly severing his final lifeline and dropping him back into the freezing water. Back at Meridian, the atmosphere of pure dread was about to reach its absolute, terminal zenith. Just a few hours after Marcus miserably failed to bribe me, the lead systems administrator burst into the executive suite, completely ignoring all standard protocols. According to my sources, the poor technician looked like he was about to suffer a massive coronary event right on the pristine carpet, while desperately trying to scrub the servers to meet Marcus and his illegal demands. The technology team had finally stumbled upon the hidden architecture I had quietly left behind. They discovered the physical data port connected directly to the primary cooling hardware. But far more importantly, and far more terrifyingly, they discovered it was completely sealed shut by a military-grade, hard-coded encryption lock. They had spent 3 frantic, sweating hours running every single decryption tool they possessed, but it was entirely useless. They could not crack the code. They could not delete the raw data, and they could not hide the undeniable truth of what Chloe had done. The digital black box was firmly locked in place, holding every single secret of their incompetence. and the federal inspectors were already packing their briefcases. Exactly 48 hours after the initial notification, the heavy glass doors of the Meridian Biosystems lobby slid open to admit the federal audit team. I was miles away in my pristine corner office at Apex, sipping a perfectly roasted dark blend. But the constant, frantic stream of encrypted text messages from my former team on the logistics floor painted the scene with absolute, terrifying clarity. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. 3 federal inspectors walked into the building, completely ignoring the overly enthusiastic greetings of the front desk receptionist. They were led by Special Agent Harris. According to the terrified descriptions I received, Harris was a towering, granite-faced man who looked as though he had never smiled a single day in his entire life. He wore a crisp, dark suit that seemed completely impervious to wrinkles, and he moved with the cold, calculated efficiency of a predatory shark patrolling a very shallow reef. Trailing silently behind him were 2 junior agents, each carrying heavy reinforced metal briefcases containing independent government-grade data scanning equipment. They did not wait for an official escort. They marched directly into the main executive conference room, the exact same high-end terrarium where my professional execution had been staged just weeks prior. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Chloe Thorne was standing rigidly at the front of the room, positioned awkwardly next to a massive projector screen displaying the Meridian corporate logo. The young acting director was visibly trembling. Her expensive designer heels seemed completely incapable of supporting her weight, and her hands shook so violently that the laser pointer she held was dancing wildly across the white fabric of the screen. She was desperately clutching a thick stack of index cards containing a carefully sanitized, heavily fictionalized script prepared by her frantic legal team. When Harris and his team took their seats, they did not offer pleasantries. They simply stared. Chloe cleared her throat, her voice cracking instantly under the immense pressure. She began to read from the lawyer-approved script, her tone robotic and entirely unconvincing. She nervously attempted to explain the loss of the $14 million shipment, carefully avoiding any mention of manual overrides or weekend getaways. Instead, she leaned heavily into the fabricated narrative her father had constructed. She explicitly stated that the catastrophic temperature anomaly was entirely due to a sudden, unpredictable failure of the older cooling sensors, a severe maintenance oversight left behind by the former supply chain manager, Quinn Cruz. She spoke my name out loud, trying one last time to throw my ghost under the heavy wheels of the federal machine. Agent Harris did not write down a single word. He did not open a notebook, and he did not look at the colorful graph she was projecting. He simply watched her sweat, less than 5 minutes into her agonizing presentation, right in the middle of a heavily rehearsed sentence about dynamic temperature anomalies. Harris raised a single, thick hand. The gesture was silent, but it carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a gunshot. Chloe instantly froze, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure terror. "We are going to stop right there," Harris said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that completely stripped the remaining oxygen from the room. "I have zero interest in listening to a marketing presentation. Ms. Thorne, my team did not drive 3 hours to look at corporate slideshows." He gestured abruptly to his 2 junior agents. In perfect synchronization, they placed their heavy metal briefcases onto the polished mahogany table and snapped the heavy steel latches open. They pulled out thick, braided data cables and specialized diagnostic terminals. "I require immediate, unrestricted physical access to the server rack located inside this conference room," Harris demanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "We will bypass your software interfaces and extract the raw diagnostic logs directly from the primary hardware network." Marcus Thorne, who had been sitting silently in the corner trying to maintain a facade of executive control, suddenly launched out of his chair, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked ghost. He rushed forward, waving his hands in a desperate attempt to halt the procedure. "Agent Harris, wait a moment. This is highly irregular," Marcus stammered, his polished corporate vocabulary completely failing him. You cannot just plug unauthorized federal equipment into our proprietary internal network. We have strict commercial confidentiality rights. There are highly sensitive trade secrets stored on those servers. We need our legal counsel present before you extract any raw data. Harris did not even blink. He reached directly into his interior breast pocket, pulled out a tightly folded, formally stamped legal document, and slammed it down onto the glass surface of the table with a deafening crack. It was a federal subpoena, signed by a district judge less than 12 hours ago. This is a federal compliance audit regarding the destruction of classified government property. Mr. Thorne, Harris barked, his voice suddenly sharp and dangerous. Your commercial confidentiality rights ended the moment that shipment failed. You have exactly two choices right now. You can step aside and let my technicians do their job, or I can place a phone call to the regional director and permanently revoke your operational manufacturing license right here, right now, before I even walk out of this building. Choose. Marcus collapsed back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. The entire room descended into a suffocating, terrifying silence. The legal director stared at the floor. The human resources executives held their breath. Nobody dared to speak as the federal technicians efficiently unspooled their thick black cables, walked over to the corner of the room, and plugged directly into the physical ports of the conference room server rack. The government screens lit up, lines of complex green code scrolling rapidly across the dark monitors. They were running a deep, aggressive extraction protocol, systematically tearing through the superficial layers of the Meridian network. They completely ignored the polished software dashboard and drove straight down into the bedrock of the system architecture. It took exactly 4 minutes. Harris leaned over the shoulder of his lead technician, his cold eyes scanning the raw, decrypted logs that were now flooding the federal monitor. He tapped a single, thick finger against the glass screen, completely isolating a specific sequence of data. He slowly turned around, fixing his piercing, merciless gaze directly onto Chloe. "Ms. Thorne," Harris said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that echoed clearly across the silent room. "You just stood there and officially testified that the shipment failure was entirely due to a mechanical sensor malfunction." Chloe nodded frantically, tears of absolute panic welling up in her wide eyes. Harris pointed directly at the glowing data on the screen. If the sensor simply failed mechanically, why does the unalterable physical hardware log explicitly record a manual, intentional biometric intervention? Why does it show that someone physically scanned their security badge and manually forced the primary cooling breakers into the off position exactly 2 hours before the temperature spiked? The brutal, inescapable question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The carefully constructed lie shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sob, completely breaking down right in front of the projector screen. She covered her face with her trembling hands, her tears completely ruining her expensive makeup. In that precise, devastating moment, every single terrified eye in the executive conference room slowly turned away from the sobbing girl and locked directly onto Marcus Thorne, watching the absolute destruction of his empire finally begin. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Special Agent Harris did not look away from Marcus Thorne. He merely gestured to his lead technician, who tapped a few final commands into the federal terminal. Harris possessed the exact decryption cipher to unlock the hidden black box. He had the cipher because I had personally given it to him. Suddenly, the main projector screen behind Chloe flashed brilliantly, replacing her pathetic, fabricated presentation with the raw, decrypted data extracted directly from my hidden hardware logs. But it was not just lines of green code scrolling endlessly. The screen split evenly in half. On the left side, it displayed the undeniable, time-stamped server log showing the precise moment the automated cooling alarms were forcibly overridden. Right next to it, in massive, glowing text, was the specific user identification number. It did not belong to a mechanical sensor. It belonged exclusively to Chloe Thorne. On the right side of the screen, an image materialized that caused the entire executive board to audibly gasp in unison. It was a crystal clear, high-definition still photograph captured from a covert, micro-security camera that I had personally requested be installed on the ceiling of the main cold storage vault exactly 2 years prior. The photograph captured Chloe perfectly. She was wearing a sparkling evening dress, clearly ready for her extravagant weekend party. In her right hand, she was holding Marcus Thorne's gold-tier Executive Master Access card. Her left hand was firmly gripping the heavy red handle of the primary cooling breaker, aggressively pulling it downward into the off position. Marcus launched out of his chair again, his hands shaking violently as he pointed frantically at the projector screen. "Agent Harris, please, you have to understand. This is a massive misunderstanding," Marcus babbled, his voice cracking, dripping with pathetic desperation. It was an honest, internal mistake, an unintentional glitch. She is new to the department. She simply did not understand the equipment. We were conducting an internal review to address the accident. Harris did not raise his voice, but his words hit the room like a physical shockwave, delivering the second and final fatal blow. "Do not insult my intelligence, Mr. Thorne," Harris growled, his eyes narrowing into cold, judgmental slits. That specific shipment was not standard commercial cargo. It contained highly classified, experimental federal nanochemical sensors. We knew exactly when it was compromised. In fact, we knew it was destroyed exactly 3 weeks ago, the very second the temperature spiked in your warehouse. Harris stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the shattered vice president. "You did not just attempt to cover up the destruction of $14 million of federal property. You actively conspired to frame the only employee in this entire building who actually did her job. You blamed the only person who sent us a warning, Ms. Quinn Cruz." The absolute brilliance of my fail-safe protocol was finally laid bare for all of them to see. When I designed that hidden network architecture, I did not just tell it to lock the data away in a dark vault. I programmed it with an active, aggressive defense mechanism. The exact second Chloe used her father's MasterCard to cut the power to the cooling units, my system automatically compiled the server logs, pulled the snapshot from the ceiling camera, and generated a highly encrypted, parallel report. It sent that undeniable proof directly to the secure incident portal of the Federal Department of Health before Chloe had even walked out of the warehouse. I was never a ghost in their machine. I was the architect of their destruction. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and completely merciless. The Meridian Board of Directors convened an emergency session before Agent Harris even finished packing up his thick black cables. Marcus Thorne was terminated instantly, stripped of all his corporate benefits, and publicly escorted out of the glass lobby in federal handcuffs, facing severe prison time for conspiracy and massive federal fraud. Chloe walked right behind him, crying hysterically as the local news cameras captured her profound, inescapable humiliation. Without their primary operating license, which the federal agency revoked immediately on the spot, Meridian Biosystems completely collapsed overnight. Their stock value plummeted to zero, forcing the terrified board to liquidate the entire company and sell their massive assets for absolute pennies on the dollar to avoid complete ruin. Meanwhile, I was standing in my magnificent corner office at Apex Biologistics. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, warming the rich leather of my chair. I was holding a steaming cup of expensive dark roast coffee, looking out over the sprawling city. My new chief executive officer knocked lightly on my open door and strolled into the room. A wide, deeply satisfied grin plastered across his face. "Good morning, Quinn," he said, holding up a sleek digital tablet. "I just got off the phone with the corporate liquidators. We officially acquired all of the primary warehouse facilities previously owned by Meridian. We got them for an absolute steal. It is going to take a massive amount of work to clean up their operational mess and bring the infrastructure up to our strict federal standards. I was wondering if you might be interested in serving as the head of the takeover team." I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my hot coffee. I turned to look at him, a cold, sharp, completely victorious smile spreading perfectly across my face. "Absolutely," I replied, my voice smooth and brimming with complete certainty. I know my way around there perfectly. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to this spectacular downfall today. Where are you listening to this story from right now? Please let me know down in the comments section. If you enjoyed today's journey of corporate justice, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. You will get access to the absolute best, exclusive true stories that are far too intense for us to make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay tuned for our next episode.